advocacy, and research collaborations, PBRNs foster partnerships for pragmatic, prompt resolutions. I would like to briefly review the agenda for this webinar. First, I will explain how to submit a question to our presenters. Then, Rebecca Roper, Director of the Practice-Based Research Network Initiative at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, will introduce today's presenters. We will have a question and answer session with each individual presenter and a final Q&A with all presenters after the final presentation. At the end of the webinar, I will explain how to obtain your CME Certificate of Participation for this activity. Please note that after today's webinar, a copy of the presentation slides will be emailed to all webinar participants. If at any point during this webinar you have trouble hearing our presenters, please try hanging up the phone or headset and dialing back into the webinar. Please note that none of today's presenters will discuss off-label use and/or investigational use of medications in their presentations. None of today's presenters have financial relationships to disclose either. To submit a question, you may use the GoToWebinar control panel. Type a question under the question section and hit send as shown in the screenshot on this slide. You may submit a question at any time throughout the presentation. During the Q&A sessions, as time allows, your questions will be read out loud and our presenters will respond. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Roper.
Thank you very much, Christina. So this is Rebecca Roper, and Dr. Victoria Neal, who has championed more than a dozen Annals of Family Medicine volumes about PBRNs, had thought that with the 2014 publication, how nice it would be if the AHRQ PBRN community would provide a venue for a few of the contributors to that special volume to talk about their publication. And to that end, we've opened it up to folks that published in that volume, but our challenge to them is to really articulate some of the issues that they find with PBRNs, where they can go, where primary care needs to go, so they have greater latitude. We seek to use this particular webinar as a means to hear from the leaders, some of the leadership in the PBRN community as they speak to us, and to challenge AHRQ and others as to what infrastructure next steps need to be pursued as a dialogue. So we have three wonderful presenters today. First, we will hear from Dr. Jim Werner, and he, as you well know, is at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. He holds a doctorate in health and behavioral sciences from the University of Colorado and several other degrees. He directs the PBRN Shared Resource of the Cleveland Clinic and Translational Science Collaborative, otherwise known as the CTSA, and the PBRN core facility at the Case Comprehensive Cancer Center. He is principal investigator of the collaborative Ohio Inquiry Network, COIN, an AHRQ-wide PBRN Centers of Excellence sponsored by AHRQ. And I'll introduce all three of our presenters now. Second, we will hear from Dr. Rebecca Etz, who is a cultural anthropologist with expertise in qualitative research methods and design. There are three main drivers to her work. Meaningful research begins with purposeful listening to the most likely to be affected by your work. The second is current primary care delivery does not yet do enough to embrace the experiences of health, illness, and outcomes in a meaningful fashion to patients and their family. And third, engagement of the community members and care providers holds great promise for bringing the worlds of medicine, public health, and community together in collaboration for improved population health. And our third presenter will be Dr. Larry Green, who is a family physician who has been involved with PBRN since they were conceived. His current work emphasizes health policy, particularly redesigning practice to integrate primary care and behavioral health, payment for primary care, and graduate medical education. He just concluded an 8-year term on the National Committee on Health and Vital Statistics and serves on the Board of Directors of the American Board of Medical Specialties, ABMS, and is a member of the Institute of Medicine. We have quite the esteemed and thoughtful presenters, and so I will turn the presentation over to Jim Werner, who will give us a 20-minute presentation, and then we will solicit questions and welcome a dialogue. Welcome, Dr. Werner.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for the introduction. I'm humbled to be part of this panel today with such esteemed colleagues. So I think it will be interesting to discuss some of these issues and then hopefully to have a good discussion and questions when we're finished. So my co-presenter today, who's not able to be with us, is Kurt Stengi. And Kurt is on a family vacation to the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos don't have a lot of internet connectivity from what I've been told. So Kurt may be photographing tortoises or something like that at this point. But he's disappointed that he wasn't able to be here for this presentation today because a lot of what I'm going to talk about really is built on Kurt's innovative work, pioneering work really on the area of boundary spanning or partnering across organizational and institutional boundaries, and how that can be so incredibly beneficial to improving health and doing meaningful health research. So today I'd like to focus on how PBRNs are partnering in innovative ways. And first, it's important to recognize, though, that PBRNs are already skilled in partnering, and partnerships are central to what a PBRN actually is, developing partnerships between practices and between practices and academics and other partners to conduct collaborative research, which in and of itself, as we all know, is no small feat, but sometimes we may actually take for granted what we do. And I think that's one of the things that our academic centers and CTSAs and others value about us, is we do know how to do that collaborative research in practice and how to make those collaborations happen. But today, increasing numbers of networks are crossing new boundaries, really in pursuit of the triple aim and in response to challenges and opportunities in their environments. And of course, the healthcare environment itself is rapidly changing, as is the health research funding environment. And some networks are finding ways not only to just maintain, but to increase their impact as they respond to these changes and these challenges. And to do that, they've exceeded their comfort zones, kind of gone beyond where they're established and comfortable, because that's where the opportunities lie, and that's really where the needs lie. And so what the networks that I'm going to talk a little bit about today are doing, a lot of this work has to do with the social determinants of health, which are driving lifestyle behaviors, which is driving chronic disease, which is driving utilization and cost, and all of the other issues related to the healthcare system today. And so by spanning these boundaries, by going into new areas, by going out of their comfort zones, they're able to address social determinants in ways that PBRNs heretofore haven't been able to do as effectively. So, what I'd like to talk about today is what are our comfort zones? The networks, again, that stretch their comfort zones. Why do they engage in this work? What challenges are they facing? What methods are they using? And then what kinds of resources can we draw upon? What infrastructures can we draw upon to be able to do this work in our settings, in different contexts? Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, I think it will be helpful to talk about this with some context for what I'm referring to as our comfort zones, recognizing that different networks have different comfort zones. So we're all coming to this with different experiences, and certainly there's wide variation in what folks in different networks are comfortable doing. But these circles might be useful, and they're from a paper that Kurt published back in 2011. And I hope it's a useful frame for thinking about the domains of the kinds of research that we do in the areas that we work in. So next. So in the pursuit of health, go ahead. Really, PBRNs have worked, of course, very extensively in primary care. Early PBRNs focused on primary care practice, describing the content of primary care, understanding of the relationships between primary care doctors and patients, and seeking to understand how that is unique and special, and how that fosters healing, and really establishing the uniqueness of primary care and the science base of primary care. Okay, next. And in addition to that, really looking at, again, relationships between doctors and patients and how we can meet the needs of patients through our healthcare systems and practices. And there were numerous PBRN studies in the 1990s focusing on practices as organizations. Okay, you can go next. And really how practices can be conceived as complex adaptive systems, seeking to understand why some practices are really functional healing environments and other practices are less so, both healing environments for their patients and for the people who work in them, and the degrees to which that happens and why that happens. So, okay, you can go next. And then finally, PBRNs are now partnering with healthcare systems and regional quality improvement organizations to improve the quality of care, efficiency, and to develop learning collaboratives that are very powerful to be able to do this kind of work with systems, not only within health systems, but across different health systems. Here in Cleveland, we have Better Health Greater Cleveland, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Learning Collaborative that has been going for a number of years and has been able to really move the needle on health outcomes with chronic disease health outcomes in diabetes and hypertension, for example. Okay, so next. So other networks are kind of going beyond these already very ambitious contexts and engaging patients and families through primary care practices and through community organizations, neighborhood groups as well, and other types of organizations such as social service agencies to work on, for example, improving health behaviors, engaging practices and patients and health and fostering healthy physical and social environments is another area where networks have begun to work, where people, they live, work, and learn where their health behaviors happen, the things that impact their health really takes place. And so this has led to partnerships with public health departments and communities in very powerful ways to improve population health. And next. In addition to that, PBRNs are working with communities and public health to improve the quality of the physical environments and social environments that people work in. Next. And then PBRNs are beginning to engage with employer groups and organizations that directly influence the environments that people work in, the health of the population, and helping these networks or helping these organizations to perhaps become more responsible and evolvable. And that's a lofty goal, and that, for me at least, is still pretty far out there on the horizon. But PBRNs have been able to achieve these amazing things already, and many networks are moving into these areas, or have, for some networks, been residing in these areas for a long time, of the circles with the blueprint in them. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so again, while recognizing that networks can differ a great deal from one another, I've just kind of lumped these into three crude categories based on what I just talked about, the historical focus of PBRNs on practices and healthcare systems kind of being the center of our comfort zone as PBRN leaders. I hope that's not my my computer with the battery level. Okay, I'm using a desktop, so that shouldn't apply to me. Okay, and so, but I think it may be reasonable to posit that primary care PBRNs are most comfortable in this world. This is where we're really very much at home and have done research since the very beginning. Other networks, as I mentioned, have expanded their comfort zones in this kind of intermediate range, engaging in regional quality improvement, partnering with public health departments, and then some are working in the final category there with in partnership between clinics and healthcare systems with community organizations and patient groups, social service agencies, and faith-based organizations, schools, and other groups. And these comfort zones have traditionally been comfort zones for community-based researchers, community-based participatory researchers and others. But PBRNs now are developing this same capacity. Some have been doing this for a long time, and others are now just beginning to work in this environment. Okay, next slide. Okay,
One
next.
second, please. We're having some technical difficulties. One moment.
Okay.
So while they work through the technical difficulties, Jim, could you care to comment on some of the comfort zones, expanding beyond your comfort zones, to what extent maybe others came to the PBRN and led them to go into a different area that wasn't a traditional activity area for them?
Yeah, you know, Rebecca, that's a great question, and I think that that PBRNs have been responsive to their environments, and the opportunities more and more are really in addressing things related to the triple aim of cost, quality, and improved patient outcomes. And I think less research is being funded for studies that don't directly address that. So it's been in some ways out of necessity, in that if we want to make an impact on these important areas and we want to be able to get resources and funding to be able to do important studies, it's important that we develop these capacities to be able to do this kind of work, to address social determinants of health, to work with communities, to work with public health, to work with social service agencies if need be, to kind of go where the needs are and find a way to flexibly partner as PBRNs with other organizations to be able to do this kind of work, to do this kind of research. So I think it's been in some ways in response to the environment. We can back up one slide or two, please.
Thank you.
That's it. Great. So, and this kind of brings us to this, this slide that probably many of us have seen before, that we have our comfort zones, whether personally or professionally, that things work well within, we're comfortable in, and we have mastery over. But as is so often the case, the magic happens beyond our comfort zone. And perhaps this is because growth is important for the health of organizations as well as people, as opposed to stagnation. And as I was just mentioning, because the changing environment is requiring us to go beyond where we're comfortable in order to continue to have an impact. So it's both our kind of our biggest friend and our biggest foe, in that it pulls us forward to be able to do things we've never done before. But there are certainly challenges in developing the capacities that we need and the expertise that we need and the skills and relationships that we need to be able to do this kind of work in other settings and partnering with other kinds of organizations. But the great thing, again, about PBRNs is we are partnership organizations. So many of those skills are second nature, I think, to practice-based researchers who have been partnering and brokering partnerships between academics and practices and situations like that for many years. Okay, so next. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about some networks that are doing this kind of work that seem to regularly really push outside of their comfort zones to do impactful practice-based research, that don't kind of shrink back from these challenges. And some of them have been doing this for a very long time and sharing their work with us and encouraging us to kind of come along with them. And one of those is the Oklahoma Physicians Research Network, or OKPRN, which has engaged in developing a primary care extension program that is linking primary care practices with public health and academic centers to provide various kinds of technical assistance and training, and they're really one of their hallmark areas of expertise, practice facilitation, to really address priority health conditions in communities and address social determinants of health. And they've also developed health improvement organizations among nonprofit service organizations, and they're connecting primary care clinics with these social service agencies and public health departments and schools, tribes, and hospitals. So they are doing really amazing work, really going upstream to address these social determinants by creating partnerships between primary care practices, public health, and others. And then again, linking nonprofits together with practices to provide for patients' needs in a socially contextual way, appropriate way, so as these agencies are tailored to the needs of patients. So really a great model and kind of beckoning us to kind of come forward and emulate some of the things that they're doing. Next is the High Plains Research Network, which in my mind at least is the network that I associate with kind of going beyond that boundary of community engaged research that I, at least in my mind, had always kind of been there, that we know how to engage with practices, we know how to engage in the medical community. How do we engage with community members themselves, community organizations? And so their community advisory councils routinely guided the development and implementation of these community-based research projects. So they've done amazing things that, for example, recently, a year or two ago, I believe it was, they developed effective local messages to promote colon cancer screening and hypertension, and they were developed by more than 1,000 patients collaborating together using a method that this network developed known as boot camp translation. So it's amazing what they've been able to do by marrying together what we kind of, in my mind at least, is a traditional practice-based research network model with developing great facility to work with patients and communities and truly kind of walking the walk of allowing patients to have a very strong voice in what the network pursues and what the network does. Okay, and then the next example that I would like to share is that with RiosNet in New Mexico, recruiting patients from diverse communities across the state to participate in a study of community-level perceptions about low-risk health research. What are patients' perceptions of working with researchers? And historically, there has not been, it's an understatement to say there hasn't been much trust between academic centers and communities, particularly communities of color. And so they were exploring with community members, what are these issues? What are their perceptions? And so they were able to identify that there isn't a great deal of trust, and that people in communities wanted partnerships with researchers, not just to be studied, which is nothing that we haven't heard before if you're familiar with community-based research. But I think it's great for the PBRN community to become very much aware of these issues, even though we're working with practices. The patients in those practices are they have their own perspectives on doing research, and they don't want one-way relationships, but to influence what gets studied in their communities. And then finally, LANet is partnering with FQHCs and other practices to conduct interventional studies with immigrant Latino families aimed at improving parenting skills and developing relationships between schools and parents to reduce childhood aggression and violence through culturally appropriate interventions, and using their network kind of as a platform to be able to do this kind of work. So this is really very innovative and groundbreaking, and these networks certainly deserve a great deal of credit for moving us as a discipline in this direction. Okay, next. So these are the partners that I just mentioned that these groups are partnering with. Next. So these are some resources that are supporting this kind of work. Of course, PCORI, the CTSA pilots, and if you're affiliated with the CTSA, they're generally community engagement pilots, and of course groups in community engagement that can provide a lot of expertise. In the prevention research centers across the U.S. also provide supplement grants to do community-based research to improve health, so that's a potential source of funding. the comprehensive cancer centers across the country do the same thing and provide pilot funds and provide an avenue also to ACS funds and other funds that you can only really get through them. So we've been able to work with our Comprehensive Cancer Center in doing community-based research. Next. Something new in collaborating with these community-based researchers that we've become aware of are FDA grants, something that we had never considered before. Next. You can just go ahead and populate the rest of the screen. And state and local initiatives, and of course, our AHRQ Centers for Primary Care Practice-Based Research and Learning, the program that's bringing this webinar about and making this possible, are great resources. And I know I'm learning a great deal from my partners across the state of Ohio in how to do different types of research because we all have different strengths. Okay, next. Okay, so really there's some challenges in broadening the vision of what's possible in creating these partnerships by understanding missions and cultures. Next. And as we've learned from community-based research, a long-term approach to partnering and being very flexible and learning from one another is highly recommended. So these are not relationships that can oftentimes develop very quickly. And I think that has really been evidenced by the groups that I just mentioned and the long-term collaborations that they've developed. Because really the basis of these interactions is really trust. Next. So one way to do this is to really enhance mutual learning and understanding. And I'm just going to go ahead and advance to the next slide. People can come back to that if they want. But this is a simple framework that's often used when organizations or groups come together that are unfamiliar with one another to better understand one another and really acknowledging that we're kind of in this for the long haul, not just project specific, but for us to be successful in not only what the immediate project is, but over the long term. We need to really understand and appreciate the strengths and challenges that each of us has faced. And so this is really sharing experiences, reflecting on that, and then what does that mean for us in the partnership that we're forming, this new thing that we're building together. Okay, next. Okay, so we have in our communities, as I think I've mentioned already, these experienced investigators, of course, in the networks that I talked about. These people are fantastic resources for how to do this kind of work. The CTSAs, the Prevention Research Centers, experienced community-based partners in your community, and then there are some really nice online resources that are on the last slide in this slide set. Go ahead. Next. Okay. In addition to that, we're training our community-based partners in how to do research. So we're training them in research methods and how to do collaborative research together. And we have a couple of fellowships through our community engagement group and our CTSA that are doing that. So more equitable partnerships emerge from situations where people both are coming at it with relatively similar amounts of knowledge and somewhat similar skill sets. Okay. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. So I have a question, and please others pose questions you can use as indicated on the slide. Jim, in this expansion of PBRNs reaching out and going beyond their comfort zone, and which is wonderful, you used the term flexible partners earlier. Could you maybe talk about some of the strategies and natural tensions that may evolve as the scope of activities extend beyond the traditional PBRN framework? Is there some outward explicit pursuit to recognize that quality improvement and practitioners' voice of particular topics are informing either the extension of the collaboration or ongoing activities in the PBRN?
You know, I think there are two types of challenges. There are internal challenges and external challenges. And the internal challenges being within the networks and deciding beginning to feel comfortable as an organization, as a group, to begin working in these different realms to try to bring everybody in the network forward together to embrace these opportunities and to develop the expertise to be able to do this, because this is talking with community-based researchers, there are landmines all around in beginning to do this kind of work. Fortunately, we're coming from a frame in practice-based research of understanding the importance of long-term relationships and of building trust. But these are conversations that happen within networks about what we're doing and where we're going as a network, and embracing that as a network as a whole, rather than just seeing it as some oddball project that is kind of off on the side of the network itself. Although that can take time, I think, to develop for people to kind of want to come forward together for that. And then outside of the networks, you know, really this learning model that I was really referring to, building inter-organizational partnerships using a model like that. And this is where I think most of the recognized challenges are in building partnerships, and that this is hard work and really trying to understand one another and creating partnerships that are beneficial for everybody involved, sharing power, sharing credit, and resisting the tendency for academic centers to kind of corner the market on a lot of those kinds of things, because we're so familiar with being the organizations through which grants are administered, and that historic role. And I find that even though I myself try not to act in that role, nevertheless, that's part of the culture that I've come up in. And so I think it takes some real self-reflection, as well as interacting with other organizations, to really develop what both parties see as equitable partnerships.
Great. Thank you for that very comprehensive response. And if you would mind holding on while we hear from Dr. Etz and Dr. Green, we'll open the floor up for more discussion after their presentations. So now we will hear from Dr. Rebecca Etz.
Well, thank you. And thanks. I'd really like to thank the folks at AHRQ, in particular for including me today with Drs. Werner and Green. I think these presentations really speak to each other well, and I find it most fitting to be following Jim's discussion of PBRN comfort zones. Breaking out of these kinds of comfort zones is exactly what I'm interested in, and I often wonder if we get trapped in a certain kind of way by the status quo that makes the really important work that we do not meaningful or not feasible for those whom we hope to most help. If you could do the next slide, please. As a start to this conversation, I'd refer to the recent policy brief our team wrote for that special issue on PBRNs that Rebecca talked about earlier. In it, we contrasted the primary care workforce innovations as found in peer-reviewed literature with what we found in a national cohort of 190 practices, exemplars. The literature told a very particular kind of story about primary care innovation. And in that story, innovation was driven by an interest in particular disease or disease clusters. It happened in small incremental steps and generally produced solutions that weren't sustainable, especially in the current financial environment, which, if we're all being honest here, is particularly hostile to primary care. So for solutions found to work, little was reported in terms of context, and I think this is one of the great ironies, because we have a tremendous focus on reporting studies in ways that ensure reproducibility of the research protocol, but not for reporting results in ways that equally ensure the reproduction of the results. What we found among exemplar practices was really quite different. So in the exemplar innovations, they were locally defined, they were responsive to local resources and constraints, they necessarily pulled on area and community resources, so their solutions were not isolated or simply internal to the practice. It also turns out, when that's your framework, that other things kind of join along for the ride. The innovations were disruptive in the very best sense of that word. They were responsive to patient experiences of illness. They focused on the health of patients rather than the control of illness. And they tended to be comprehensive in their approach. In other words, when making a change or adopting a new process, they were not motivated to take a shortcut, addressing the needs of a small group with only the worst circumstances in order to demonstrate the biggest impact. They tended to their practice, to their patient panels, and to their community as a whole. And it really stood in stark contrast. What I take from this falls along these lines. Translational science, as introduced and implemented by NIH, was meant to speed up the adoption of best practices. And our study of these 190 exemplars suggests that despite this effort, many obstacles still remain. Our work just can't be about how to get efficacious study findings or research-defined best practices into everyday settings. It must also recognize that happening all around us in PBRNs and non-PBRN practices, practice-defined best practices may be accomplishing what translational research has yet to achieve: rapid adoption, active learning, and carry-through of solutions over time. Next, please. This really leads me to ask if it's time to move beyond the paradigm of translation. Simply put, we need to do better. And for those of you who don't recognize the figure in the middle of the screen there, that's Louis Pasteur, who famously talked about the need for the prepared mind in order to take advantage of changes and create innovation. We need a new research arm that's something like a PBRN-inspired version of translation. We need to remember the foundations upon which PBRNs once drew their strength and what was so special about what we did. And for any on the phone who have not read the short history of PBRNs that Larry, the next speaker, wrote in 2006, I really highly recommend it. It's worth the read to help us remember why it's so important for us to do this work, what it means for the health of populations as well as the health of our discipline. Before PBRNs, primary care was an endpoint for other people's work. Once the problems were identified and the solutions found, primary care was a receptor site where the results of that research might find a place to be a home. It was the creation of PBRNs that established primary care as a meaningful source for new insights and the advancement of knowledge. So my worry about translational research as it happens right now, and not all of course, but our work on the policy brief certainly suggests this as a fair warning. My worry is that once again we're becoming a popular receptor site, that we are the place of translation for ill-fitting solutions from falsely defined problems when we should be about reclaiming the authority of knowing the right questions, the right questions that need our right solutions at this right time. So what we need are new ways of thinking about what comes after translation. Translation is the idea of taking what's proven efficacious and getting it to work in the real world. And so the issues around this are multiple for me, and I'm just going to mention a few that are here on the screen. One is that the problems are defined by research programs and funder priorities, not as problems rooted in the realities of where people live, work, and play. The solutions are identified within idealized circumstances that include propped up resources, structures, and motivations that just don't exist in natural circumstances, making them hampered as solutions when the research is over. And the methods required to satisfy funders and traditional scientific review typically rely on using sets of knowns. A classic example is, studies that measure BMI or A1C as known measures when the study timeline or intervention is also known to make movement of those markers highly unlikely. So what we really need are new ways of seeking and learning, and these are unknowns, but I would suggest that we have to get out of our comfort zones and embrace the unknown in using all of our might to solve it. Next. So I really like the image that appears at the top of this slide because it creates a really startling contrast between these two pictures. Both are functional, both are buildings, but one looks like the kind of place I'd like to be, and the other does not. And my sense is that right now we are in between the two and trying to decide which path we're going to take. The one to the left is easier, but the one to the right is far more attractive. And it seems to me that we're facing what I would call an innovation gap, that we are once again failing to recognize primary care platform and those that work within it as the source of new insights and the potential for new knowledge. To address that kind of gap, PBRNs frankly need some reimagining. And for me, this means allowing more research that's exploratory rather than explanatory. I'm an anthropologist, so I have a natural bias here, but I think that it means embracing studies in which the qualitative can lead to the quantitative and not just vice versa. It also means allowing for problem definitions that begin with the needs of actual people rather than abstract populations or small groups of people defined not actually as people, but by what ails them. I think it equally means allowing for problem definitions that begin in practices and the everyday fiscal, regulatory, political, community settings in which they're located. Perhaps also important is allowing for research designs able to adapt to the context-specific solutions without creating this sort of always false dichotomy of the small, particular, idiosyncratic solutions on the one hand or the large, general, translatable solutions on the other. I truly believe in a country of over 320 million people that the quest to find some grand solution that is grandly translatable may be a little misguided, and even some regional thinking could be in order. So PBRNs, I think, are really particularly well placed to address these concerns if they can address some of their own current stumbling blocks. We need research infrastructure that is nimble so that we can react with the same speed at which we need to produce our results. That means creating PBRN-specific means for negotiating the necessity of oversight, HIPAA, IRBs, et cetera, without going into apoplectic fits. It means figuring out new ways of building research that doesn't require focusing on NIH and funder mechanisms to seed the new ideas, but rather using strategies like Jim proposed earlier to leverage the resources around you. I'm also really a firm believer that we need to accept that not all research needs to be big R, that PBRNs can do their own TDSA-like learning cycles, just like practices, that not all research needs to be big places and big numbers in order to have big impact, and that the strength of numbers, really works both ways, big and small. The current trend, I think, to focus on large systems and ACOs worries me a bit because it undermines the very strength that PBRNs first brought to the table and relies on data models that are truly not of our own creation. Next. In this sense, I think it comes down to a basic question: what is good research and how do we know it when we see it? Reimagining PBRNs for me involves good research. Any research, no matter the field, no matter the approach, I'm sorry, just the previous slide, please. No matter the approach, relies on evidence that matters, expert knowledge that informs, and a research design that creates the parameters of your study. These things are negotiated across disciplines, but they always remain the same. These are the elements of good research. Next, please. Reimagining PBRNs then means creating new ways of seeing. So these new ways of seeing out of our comfort zone, based on the data important to us and embracing of the unknown, requires that we reimagine our most basic terms in ways different from how they're used now, and yet consistent with the definition of good work. And this may mean a different approach to the words we hold dear. I've listed several of these on the screen. Translation. So what's the new version of this? We need both work that systematically captures contextual factors that inform study design and work that closely resembles natural experiments in their design. We cannot translate what is known to work through efficacious studies into everyday practice if the parameters of those studies were incongruous with the realities of everyday practice. We need a new understanding of fidelity, reflective of research designs that are not about manualized processes, but are about clearly understanding the phenomena being examined or tested, maintaining the integrity of that, while at the same time allowing for variation in interpretation. That's usually what makes for meaningful and potentially successful implementation in the future. Sustainability, it's hearsay, I know, but I really wish I could get rid of it. I would aim for something more like viability in the face of continuous change. In an industry and platform whose survival is dependent on the ability to change and adapt, I truly don't understand why sustainability would be our target. I think we need viability. I think we need improved capacity. And sustainable problem-solving strategies is probably how I would focus. I would make strategies equal to models. I think models are very helpful to think through problems and for planning, but they often become too prescriptive in their application and don't allow for tailored or adaptive learning. They're also often built on a set of assumptions and constraints that change dramatically over time and become obsolete way too quickly for the amount of investment it took to make them. So a great example is here is those who create business models in primary care that are appropriate to the current funding environment are usually hardest hit when that funding environment seems to change dramatically year over year. Likewise, we rely way too much on the mystical powers of validated instruments. We need to embrace a willingness to experiment and to fail. The bias towards using validated instruments and known ways of measuring and established methods has, I think, created a natural obstacle towards generating new knowledge. The issues that continue to stymie us today require new ways of knowing, of examining, and of evaluating. How else do we encourage the innovation and nurture the insatiable curiosity that's required? We need to approach feasibility from the perspective of those who are left behind to do the work after we've gone, rather than our ability to make something happen. And this probably sounds very familiar to folks out there who do research. We need to accept that failure as a part of that learning rather than failure as a failed attempt, creating situations in which people in research studies continue dogmatically at something until they can get the right participation levels to suggest others should pay attention. As to the last one, which is a tough one for me because as an anthropologist I love engagement. Engagement is a word with good intentions, but one that often sets up from the beginning an always present power differential where I as research and the brain trust, I created this idea, I defined the problem, but I now ask that you engage with it. And I know this isn't how most people use it, or at least not how they intend to use it, but for me, engagement has a very unidirectional feel. So I typically talk about inspired research. I prefer research that is inspired by multiple perspectives. What in anthropology we call situated learning, or in PBRNs we call practice-based research. Next. We have some persistent challenges, which I briefly outlined here. I admit this is something of a straw figure, but it's still meaningful. Standing in the way of these solutions are entrenched notions of what makes for good research and evaluation, notions that we have established over and over again no longer fully meet the needs of the public or even, frankly, the needs of those currently conducting research. In addition, I think we have ill-fitting definitions of data points and measures useful to our learning. And in our quest to find the ultimate, the perfect, the all-inclusive data set, I think we've given up the ability to generate a meaningful baseline from which we can move forward. Next. And yet among the 190 exemplars, among many PBRNs and in many institutions, the work I have been lamenting about just now exists. For it to survive and flourish, we need simply more souls to embrace it. We have an urgent need for funding mechanisms that allow for new forms of investigation and understanding, and they must be at least equal in weight and available resource to those used to support traditional research. The sharing of clinical and community-inspired solutions is absolutely fundamental to the health of our discipline and care delivery systems as well as to our population, and it can be done. In 4 months, and with nothing more than an email message and a telephone, I was able to find over 200 examples of incredible courage, aspiration, and healing. The greatest untapped resource in PBRNs are actually the practices themselves. And by tapping into those exemplars, we can begin to learn the data points that they find most useful for self-assessment and learning, the questions they find most pressing in their communities, the areas in which they seek to fill a void in leadership, and the things they strive to learn from each other, the solutions, as it were, born from a deep commitment and belief in the value of personal doctoring. And I think that's what we need. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Etz, and please submit your questions to Dr. Etz. So when Dr. Etz, you reached out to various practices, several, and you concluded on resonating on the greatest resource among this community is being the PBRNs, the practices themselves. Bravo for your dedication to do that. What other type of community activities or infrastructure would you find to be helpful within the more traditional framework or leading us outside traditional framework for sharing amongst the practices? Kind of what's your wish list?
Man, that's a hard one, and I think that my wish list probably leads to Larry's presentation. But I think the most important need is for some ability for people to talk to each other and exchange information. And we have a lack of information exchange and health information exchange at just absolutely every level. Part of it is because we lack a unifying data model that counts for everybody. We don't have any systematic structuring of electronic medical records so that they can talk to each other even within our discipline, let alone outside of our discipline, and certainly no ability to foster that kind of sharing of knowledge and resources across buildings and streets, let alone practices. So the need to use all this wonderful technology that we have to get people to talk to each other and to be able to share information not only freely but in a meaningful way is probably one of our biggest hurdles.
Thank you. I really liked your phrasing, especially the use of the term viability instead of sustainability, which I am absolutely guilty of. I use sustainability rather than generalizability because generalizability has a very succinct and often unattainable objective. And you went through several different phrasings and redefining, getting us to think differently. In reaching out and working with these different practices, were there particular restructuring ideas that you shared with them that they were more attuned to? Are there certain next steps you think will be easier to proceed?
Yes. It was less about what I shared with them and more about what they shared with me. Mm-hmm. But they weren't motivated by needing to prove a particular question or address a particular population defined by what ails them. They were most interested in understanding what gets in the way of health for the population that they've chosen to be responsible for. And they really worked hard to figure out how they might best partner with them, build on their strengths, and help them address areas of challenge. And so they often address social determinants of health in their work. They often, I'd say maybe 50% of what they did was inside of the practice and 50% of what they did was outside of the practice. They embraced team-based care in a true sense. So they didn't say these people who work on the same hallway are now Team Green. They actually had people get together and talk about what their priorities were for care delivery and among the people who trust them with their care, and figured out as a group how to best address them with the resources available in the practice and in the community. So their approach was probably something that people like Gail Stevens or Bob Graham or Kerr White would most embrace, right? They understand that they are someone's personal doctor and that their practice by extension is the personal practice to the community in which they're situated and for whom they've chosen to accept responsibility. And they work at that, on that level. They're not worried about bending the cost curve. They're worried about bending a health curve. and that's kind of their approach, and I think we should learn by it.
Great. Thank you. So if you stay with us, Dr. Edson, Dr. Green, we look forward to your presentation and open discussions afterwards.
Well, thank you very much. I want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to follow up on that editorial and that JABFM issue that you talked about when you introduced this webinar, and appreciate it very, very much. Let's go to the next slide. That building in the middle, if you if you cast your eyes on that, then look off to either side, you'll see the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains and the Continental Divide. This is where I live. And the building immediately to the left of that one that's just sticking out a little bit, I'm sitting right about there as we're doing this webinar. And I just wanted you to enjoy how much I enjoy working on this brand new Health Science Center campus. This is the western third of it. The building on the far right, the white brick building, that's Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center, a national landmark now. That's where Eisenhower got care in the 1950s when he had his heart attack. So it's an historic place, but also a new place, and it's an absolutely fabulous place to live and work. And let's go to the next slide. My goal for my contribution to this webinar is actually AHRQ's goal for having these webinars, and it's to generate reflection to address a gap. And I'll build off of a 2007 conference and its report that was about harmonizing primary care clinical classification and data standards. I'll give you a reference for that here in a moment. And what we're really after is motivating considerations by the PBRs and AHRQ to do something about this data model gap. Let's go to the next one. It would be nice if we knew what a data model is, and there are multiple definitions, but for our purposes today, let's consider a data model to be a description. It's a description of objects that need to be represented in a system. So it's a description of objects in a system, and it includes their properties and how they relate to each other. Data models always contain a collection of concepts. Next bullet, please. And they inevitably involve classification and terminology. To clarify, classification means ordering principles. It's a set of ordering principles. Terminology is terms or words. Some people use the word taxonomy when a classification and terminology are combined. But a very important point is that data models require rules to be used. You can't deal with a model without rules. In the data world, these are usually called standards. In case you haven't noticed, standards make the world go around. And enterprises that lack standards tend to not go around, and they basically are not good primary care standards, and this is part of the explanation for why primary care continues to be neglected and struggle the way it does. Let's go to the next slide. This is one way of envisioning and seeing how health statistics sort of look. It's from the viewpoint of the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics. I want to focus your attention on that white bubble in the middle of population's health. I think there's virtually no dissent that improving population health is a good idea. And then you say, yeah, but what does that involve? Well, it probably involves dealing with diseases, function, and well-being. And it's not just the diseases themselves that we want to know about. We want to know about what level these three characteristics of a population or attributes of a population, what's the level of their prevalence, their existence, but we also want to know about their distribution. Now, population health is always nested in communities, and communities always have attributes. And you can look around this figure and you can see social attributes, biological characteristics, the built environment, health services, economic resources, population-based health programs, collective lifestyle and health practices. All of these can be further specified as you see on this figure. And then the population's health living in these communities, they exist in a broader context of the natural environment, culture, and the political context. And we human beings seem to be constrained by having to be someplace, and we're constrained by time. So when you think about data and health statistics, they actually sweep across this vista that this slide captures. Let's go to the next one. I have been stunned over the last 5 or 6 years, over and over again, of being in the middle of a conversation about primary care and discovering that the people in the conversation don't know what primary care is. So I didn't want to get further into this presentation without just reminding everyone on the call that primary care is a function. That function provides integrated, accessible services. It's done by clinicians. Those clinicians are accountable, not just for everything, but for a large majority of personal health care needs. And primary care requires developing a sustained partnership with patients. And it also requires practicing in context, in the context of the patient's family and the patient's community. That's the official definition of primary care. It's been standing since it was developed in 1994. So it's a 20-year-old definition. And when I'm talking about a data model for primary care, I'm talking about the data necessary to integrate care, provide first point of contact accessible services, data clinicians need to address a large majority of the personal health care needs that people have, and doing so in a sustained partnership and contextualizing it all to family and community. I guess it's arguable, but I think that there's a case to be made that the data required for primary care is medicine writ large, is medicine's biggest data challenge. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just build off of that conference. Here's a quick reprise. We're indebted to AHRQ for funding a Healthcare Research and Quality Conference grant. John White was the project officer for it. Bob Phillips was director of the Graham Center then, and he hosted the conference and chaired it. Next, please. The attendees at this conference included experts from AHRQ, the World Health Organization, National Library of Medicine, CDC, NCBHS, NOMED. It was almost a new office at that point, the Office of the National Coordinator, a lot of health IT vendors, and primary care organizations. Next, please. And it grew out of a concern that the health information technology standards were evolving rapidly without sufficient attention to primary care, which just happened to be and still continues to be the largest platform of formal healthcare delivery. The key decision from that conference was that it was very important to act now. That would be the end of 2007, 3/4 of a decade ago, to develop and promote the data model for personal doctoring and what was just being called the medical home, to support the transformations of health information technology and personalized healthcare that were underway. Next slide. So I'm very grateful to Michael Klinkman for kindly allowing me to use some of his work and his slides and for the next few slides in this. Mike was part of that conference in 2007, part of the leadership, part of getting it written up. You can see his roles there in the slide. I want to call attention to that last thing about WONCA International Classification Committee. He has chaired that. WONCA is the World Organization of Family Doctors, General Practitioners, includes people from about 70 nations, and they have a committee that's called the Classification Committee that works on this sort of stuff, and Mike has been chairing that quite admirably. Next slide. So Mike took core attributes of this medical home thing. It needs to be population focused, provide first contact care, it needs to be patient-centered, needs to be efficient, and it needs to be integrative. And then he proposed what the data needs were for that. And you can see them there. And we're going to quickly go right to the next slide, because let's go to the next slide. You'll see them again. And remember, my goal in this webinar was to identify gaps that might be addressable. And the red lettered stuff here on this slide shows the continuing gaps. From a population focused point of thing, there's been progress in registries and from first contact. We do have some capacity to capture data from both direct and indirect encounters. Not doing so well with patient-centered deficiency stuff. We've got some clinical decision support capability and disease-specific outcome measures. The integration thing needs a lot of attention. The point here is the data gaps to be population-focused, provide first contact, patient-centered care, and efficient and integrative are substantial. And it might be a good idea to address them. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a delightfully understandable slide, again, that Mike developed about, we just got to understand what the simple building blocks are to capture the complex reality of primary care. And this requires structuring our thinking a bit. And the structures here are around persons, problems, some clinical modifiers, actions that are taken, time, and data import and export protocols, basically exchange protocols, or what I guess we usually call interoperability now. That circle there, I want to just highlight that because this is an absolutely disabling problem for all primary care research, that we basically usually don't know the reasons why patients engage us when they do. We pick the data elements up further down the pike. And so RFE stands for reason for encounter. And when we think about the structure of things, about structuring the problem, most people think that they've got it when they have congestive heart failure. That's totally inadequate for the structure of an adequate primary care data model. Let's go to the next slide. So this is, again, structure. Well, then there are inputs. Forecast is on the other side in a minute. I'll show you a slide that has outputs. But in thinking about the data model, it's got to have structure, and then you got to put data into that model. But you don't do it just for the hell of it. You do it because there are outputs that you desperately need. The thing I want to emphasize here builds off of what Rebecca was talking about. People, the people that we seek to serve and who we want to promote their well-being and relieve their suffering. They are an amazing source of inputs. And, for decades, the outstanding primary care investigators have been calling for a data model where we capture in the patient's very own words why they are seeking help. So that's just an example of an input that could be in the data model. Some could be primary, some could be secondary, but let's go to the next slide and look at outputs. So remember that what we really need in primary care to do the primary care function of contextualization to family and community is we need to have some local practice control over the outputs we get out of the data that are assembled. So examples, aggregate views that help you with meeting your HEDIS measurement requirements, or aggregate longitudinal views. As everyone knows, primary care sees, only, no more than half of the problems that come into primary care ever become diagnosed at a 5-digit level. And what we really need are prior and posterior probabilities about the problems that people bring into primary care. We also have needs for cross-sectional stuff like the dashboards that are actually beginning to work pretty well in current EHRs. But that longitudinality, getting to episode history, this is a big hole in our boat. And the data structures and models we use now are very poor. It basically can't really do an adequate job of creating episodes of care and letting comorbidity influence them come in and out of them. So you get the idea here. Outputs under local practice control would be very important to improve primary care and to execute the primary care function. Let's go to the next slide. So I thought Michael also did an excellent job of offering this very succinct characterization of the current primary care health information technology environment. And I suspect that you folks on the call will largely agree that there's a lot of information overload. We've got a lot of one-size-fits-all stuff that doesn't really help us all that much. We really are having a hard time with comorbidity and how interrelated problems come together in real-world patients and their complexity. You see the rest of the list there, and I think that it's fair to say that practice-based EHRs just don't support distributed care across networks the way Rebecca was describing, moving beyond PBRNs and the way Jim was talking about that expansion of the whole idea of what a PBRN is. There's quite a gap there in the current environment in what is required and needed. Next slide. Those are the references that I indicated that would be coming up. That first one is easy to get to if you just go to the Graham Center website and click on reports, and you can find it there. It's a bit long, but it is absolutely, I know of no better resource to start from to think about this primary care data model stuff. It sort of brings things up to speed there in 2007, and unfortunately there's not been a whole lot of progress on it ever since, so you're not missing a whole lot. If you get that, you'll have a good foundation to think about it. And that last one is the link to the World Organization Family Doctors Classification Committee website. And that might be important to you because that's the home of the International Classification of Primary Care, which is field-tested, works, is used in many other countries, hardly at all in the United States. But that classification system incorporated into a data model has the capacity for episode epidemiology, which is like the holy grail for understanding the prognoses of patients. Next slide. I'm using this picture here because it's a road, and you can't see where the roads come from or where the road's going. And it just sort of represents to me where we are in the primary care journey. And it's relevant to the journey to having a data model. If you'll, let's go back to that slide just for a moment. If you'll indulge me, while you're looking at that road, I want to share with you the beginning and ending of a Robert Frost poem. It's called Directive. It's a rather long poem. I'm not going to do the whole poem, but it opens up with these words: back out of this now too much for us, back in a time made simple by the loss of detail, burned, dissolved, and broken off like graveyard marble sculpture in the weather. There is a house that is no more a house, upon a farm that is no more a farm, and in a town that is no more a town. But the road is there. If you'll let a guide direct you who only has at heart you're getting lost. It ends with these words: here are your waters and your watering place. Drink and be whole again beyond confusion. Primary care probably needs a big drink at the data model watering place so it can be whole and beyond confusion and reach out to become that house, Frank Lloyd Wright's house that Rebecca showed in her slides. You may recall from George Carlin, one of his quotes was that there's no problem, however serious, that we in the United States cannot roll up our sleeves and completely ignore. And I added this slide just as a reminder that if we don't get on with this and we don't figure out the primary care data model, we're basically saying to this rapid expansion of the information age for it to go on without us. Somebody needs to close that gap and get serious about this. And I am optimistic and hopeful that perhaps AHRQ and the PBRNs can step into this space with enthusiasm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. And please, folks, post your questions, and I'll read them out and share them with Dr. Green. The reason for encounter seems, as you identify, Dr. Green, is an often overlooked critical element of the access to care and understanding the context which brought the patients to the primary care setting. When you've spoken with folks about this issue, could you just provide us some more reflections on how they responded, or some of the ideas to which they were maybe more receptive than others?
Yes, I can. Let me do it by characterize what I've noticed by audiences. If I talk to patients, normal people, they love it. They say, "Oh, you mean you start off with what I care about and the way I see it and what I'm experiencing?" You say, "Yes." They virtually universally say, "Yeah, that makes sense to me." If you talk to someone writing code for a software developer, they say, "We have to structure this thing. Unstructured data are a waste of time. Let us give you a drop-down box." If you talk to the audience of the people that are busy trying to form teams and practices to enhance the performance of the PCMH in an ACO world, they want to distribute collecting that to the cheapest cheapest staff person that they can, so that if there's a more expensive person like a clinician, that by the time they see the patient, the reason for the visit's already recorded, orders have already been made, standing orders have already been exercised. The patient may have interacted with 4 or 5 other people, and now whoever is the clinician involved sees the patient for the first time, and there's no reason to go back over that territory. There's a widely different set of reactions, Rebecca, to reason for encounter.
Thank
Personal
you.
physicians, people that have longitudinal relationships with patients for, like residents, even for as much as 18 months, they get it. They know the difference of what it's like to walk in and the patient look them in the eye and then look them back and say, "Good to see you. This is what I'm here for. I'm really scared. I'm worried about X, Y, etc." That sort of thing. It is an intensive, rich thing, often misinterpreted in health services literature. This is where the 17-second rule came from, that excellent primary care clinicians within 17 minutes or so are already formulating hypotheses. This early reason for the encounter and the interaction there is so incredibly rich with information. And even an excellent RFE classification scheme and coding and terminology doesn't do it justice, but it would sure do better than the drop-down box.
And in the parallel, so in the emergency room, which the caregivers there would have hopefully less experience dealing with patients. But is there any analogy about the contextual reasons for encounter in the triage process of the hospital that either it has been or should be considered in that holistic approach? That's somewhat limited because you don't have the personal experience that you would with a primary care clinician who's familiar with her patients.
A really important thing you're calling out there, Rebecca, about the difference, what a difference the setting makes. Well, I guess there's 3 reactions I have to that. One is, unfortunately, there are those repeat visitors, the AHRs, that are just as well known there as primary care patients are in their medical homes. So sometimes they have the emergency room has the same needs that a pediatrician, general internist, primary care nurse practitioner, or PA, family physician would need. However, if you'll allow, I'll rotate your question toward just thinking about the data model there in the emergency room. What would really help the primary care folks if the data model and the EHR included identification of a genuine personal physician for each patient who was notified almost automatically that they had a patient in that emergency room. And in a modernized, high-tech IT world, it might be almost synchronous care and synchronous notification of the primary care source that they've got a live one in an emergency room in Cincinnati. Sure, the patient lives in Houston, but right now they're in the emergency room in Cincinnati. And if the emergency room's data model presumed that every person they saw would have a personal clinician that needed to know they were there, early on in that emergency room visit, the key data collected would be who is that person. And in my idealized version of this, before they ever get started, there's notification, and it creates the connectivity where the personal health record and that person's goals, etc., land right in that ER, maybe 30 seconds later or no more than that. Wouldn't that be lovely?
It would be lovely. So thank you. So having had these three wonderful presenters, Dr. Werner, is there some reflections you care to share with the group in either a statement or posing of a question, having heard each of the wonderful presentations today?
Well, I'm compelled to want to do something about this problem, this data model problem, and also some of the challenges that Rebecca posed to us. So, Larry, you mentioned in the latter part of your presentation that perhaps AHRQ could make some progress in moving towards a data model. Can you share with us what what could realistically happen, or given resources moving in that direction, what would be the best thing that could happen over the next, say, year?
Well, Jim, I'm stumbling over the word best. I don't know that it's necessarily the best, but I can propose something that seems sensible to me, and it's basically to replicate what AHRQ did back in 2007, recognizing that the problem is not solved. There are an important set of data gaps that need to be addressed. And I would think that one way to proceed is for AHRQ to invite the PBRNs and perhaps many of the same suspects that were involved in 2007 to revisit the challenge and try to define where in the current landscape a primary care data model now fits. Where are we? What pieces of it are in place? What pieces are missing? So, you know, to call a meeting is kind of a lame response to what you're talking about, Jim. But it seems to me that this requires conversation among experts. And I think the PBRNs are full of experts. I would also think that a part of a sensible way forward is to get the people who represent patients as advocates into this conversation about what do the people we seek to serve want to have in their personal health record, and how do they want it to be used in population health, and how do they want the integration with mental health to occur. This is complicated, and it would be really nice to have some sort of a national summit about the primary care data model that could stimulate work. And it's not too late to continue to modify the electronic health records. So you'd want the vendors involved in this also, I believe. One way to highlight that, Jim, is to not make it about primary care or PBRN, but there's actually no logic model that gets to achieving the triple aim without a foundation of primary care. And I think that's an acceptable fact. And if we want to achieve the triple aim, we're going to need primary care, and we can't get primary care done right without getting interoperability and the data exchanges right. So turn it into a bit of a national emergency to achieve the triple aim. That would be part of the framing. What are your reactions to that, Jim and Rebecca?
My reaction is that I think that makes complete sense, that the triple aim cannot be achieved in any way without primary care really at the heart of the healthcare system. And because we are in essentially a state of emergency as a country with respect to healthcare, that could be framed as an impetus to do something, that there has to be some resolution to this long-standing problem if we're going to move forward and make good progress towards, achieving the triple aim. So that's my reaction to that. Rebecca?
I think that I would have probably a similar reaction, but lately I've been thinking a lot about the sort of the efforts that primary care practices seem to go through right now to prove that what they do is worthy. And it seems an incredible amount of work. And I think that the feeling that you have to prove that what you do is worthy is one that kind of chips away at your confidence and your belief that you really are worthy. And I wonder if the field doesn't suffer from that a bit. And I would love, I think I'm really captivated by the data model idea, and I wonder if we actually had one, that we wouldn't find it so difficult to talk about what would be appropriate measures for the field, for instance, or in what way does the field of primary care or the function of primary care actually help with the triple aim. I think that those things would become self-evident because we would have an identifiable language. Absent that, it's something of a Tower of Babel. I think, although I agree, Larry, calling a meeting seems like a lame starting point. If you get the right passionate people there, it can also be a wonderful launching point.
Well, I think primary care has to answer the bell. If there's national leadership for getting on with this, I think it places a burden on primary care to drop the victimization attitude and actually do the heavy lift. I mean, we have to explain what the data are that are required to execute the primary care function going forward. We have a duty. There's a professional duty there for the nurses, the doctors, and the health services researchers.
Yeah, just along those lines too, and more of a popularization mode of getting more people to really understand and appreciate this problem. Larry, I wonder if you would have ever considered maybe doing a TEDx talk or something like that to make this problem accessible to policymakers and other people who aren't intimately familiar with the situation that we have and why this affects our ability to improve health and healthcare. You would be a wonderful speaker to do something like that, and you have a real gift for making things, complex concepts, I think, understandable to almost everybody.
Well, I think that's a little overly generous, and I have thought about it, but that thought usually goes into wanting to get a good-looking woman to give the talk.
Well, I thank all three of you for this very thoughtful series of presentations. And although we won't be on TEDx branding, this presentation will be available on AHRQ's YouTube channel. And so we will encourage you all to share it with others widely who are interested in the content and may be incentivized to pursue these types of activities further. So it's been a most enjoyable series of presentations for me and thought-provoking as well. And I thank you for the presentation and for the folks who joined us on the phone. I would say for those who did join us, you can receive CME credits as described below. And once you exit this webinar, if you could take a few moments to complete our assessment of this particular presentation, it would be much appreciated. And we went through it, but we'll be back live. We're taking April off for presentation on May 1st. We're returning to our methodology series with how pragmatic is it? Lessons learned using PRECIS and re-aims for determining pragmatic characteristics of research, where we will have colleagues of ours from PCORI giving the presentation. And we will be sending out a PDF file of this presentation that we gave today a little later. Feel free to distribute to folks our open invitation to join our PBRN listserv. We've been growing a little bit, which is most welcome. Also, I can report that we have dozens of lapsed registrant PBRNs, but we're beginning to see that count diminish as well. But it's just been a delight, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And thank you very much, Christina, for working through a little bit of a technical glitch so smoothly. I appreciate everyone's efforts today. Thank you.
Thank you.